Welcome back to the third Design Doctor. This one is again from the Dungeon Dude's book, Sebastian Crowe's Guide to Drakkenheim. This is the Malfeasant Wizard subclass we're looking at. And for this one, I wanted to dig down a little bit more and start to look at what are some of the fundamentals of design? What are some ideas that we could start to draw from as far as game design goes? What can we make that is going to be fun for the players and for the DM? So to start this, let's start by looking at something called horizontal versus vertical progression. H Bomber Guy did a great video on Fallout New Vegas where he goes pretty deep into this. He gives a great outline as to what it is. If you want to go watch that, it's a great video. But as a simple summary is, vertical progression is when the numbers get higher. In D&D, we see this in things like the ASI, the proficiency bonus. Most skill bonuses, the numbers are just getting higher, or you're getting some kind of ability that lets you make these checks more often, succeed on these checks more often, I should say. Magic weapons and armor oftentimes have flat bonuses to AC or resistances to damage. These are all things of vertical progression. The champion fighter is a good example of a subclass in that you're going to crit more often, but crits aren't necessarily anything special in this edition of Dungeons & Dragons. It's just extra damage. You're going to get an extra fighting style, and most fighting styles are just numbers going up, like you get +1 AC or you get +2 damage while you're wielding a weapon in one hand. Those are all examples of vertical progression. Horizontal progression is when you get a new power. Most feats are horizontal progression. You're going to get something that's going to change up your play style. It's going to let you do something new and cool. Most spells are this as well. They're going to let you do something that no other ability will let you do. Oftentimes there will be abilities that let you expend resources that you already had in a new way. A good example of this is almost all Bard subclasses at 3rd level give you a new way to spend your Bardic Inspiration. The Psi Knight Fighter and the Soul Knife Rogue both have this ability called Psi Dice that they will get right when they get their subclass at 3rd level, but then they're going to get augmenting abilities to it as they go up in levels, new ways to use an existing power. And also it's doing things in a new way. For instance, the Sorcerer with their meta magic, and in particular I'd like to highlight one of my favorite abilities, Psionic Sorcery, that you can spend sorcery points to cast a spell as if it was with Subtle Spell, but it's not actually applying the Subtle Spell meta magic, which means you can still twin it. And the fact that it doesn't use any components means that it feels like sorcery. Nobody can see you casting it. You just think, and all of a sudden it happens. And I think a good design has a good mix of both. They kind of lean in one to another. A good example might be the Battlemaster, where the dice themselves, getting this pool of dice, is definitely horizontal progression. Getting new maneuvers is horizontal progression. But the dice getting bigger, it goes to a D10 and then a D12, that is vertical progression. And I think you need both, and you want them to go hand in hand to make a good subclass. Let's give some more concrete examples to this. Let's say you are a 4th level character, you've been adventuring, and you now are leveling up to level 5. Which of these 3 abilities would you prefer? A, you get +3 bonus to all your to hit and damage rolls. B, you get extra attack. Or C, you can cast the Earth Tremor spell as a bonus action at will. Now, you could crunch the numbers and say, how frequently are opponents going to fail their Earth Tremor save? How often is a +3 bonus really going to make me hit as compared to miss? Extra attack, how often am I going to be able to target one enemy with the first attack and another enemy with the second? And you start crunching the numbers. But I think fundamentally, D&D goes beyond a numbers game, and it is partly a storytelling game in that you are building a fiction, you're building a story, and you're building a gameplay experience. And so I would argue that of these, the +3 bonus to hit and damage rolls, maybe the number is a little too low, for example. What if it was +10? And you could obviously prove, this is definitely the strongest feature that you're going to get out of these 3. I still think it wouldn't be very good. It wouldn't be a good power to give, because it doesn't lead to fun and divergent gameplay. It doesn't build a coherent gameplay style. It's vertical progression, and that's kind of boring. That's especially in a number like this, where if you had the option to take something that is actually going to change up how the game goes, how the story goes, change up how you imagine yourself in the fiction, and instead you're like, well, that number isn't as good as the number +10 bonus in this example. Another example might be, would you rather get a +4 bonus to all your wisdom saving throws always? Or would you rather get the ability whenever you take damage until the end of your next turn you have advantage on wisdom saves? I'd say the first ability is evidently more, manifestly more powerful. But the second one, advantage is roughly comparable to +4, but it, for one, advantage typically feels better, I would argue. But more importantly, by tying it to a specific event that has a fiction associated with it, you can start to build something. Now, bearing the lead here a little bit, this is a subclass ability that I gave to one of my homebrew subclasses, which is a martyr type, a flagellant type, that when they're lashed, the lash clears their mind, and they have, they have this clarity that they are more resistant to attacks against their mind. I feel like that, while it's not as powerful as the +4 bonus, it builds a coherent playstyle where you can start to say, oh, what can I do to start triggering more damage to myself, to the point where I can benefit from this ability, but also I'm not going to die very quickly. What are some ways that we can build a subclass around that? And then the character, once they have that ability in their hands, they can be like, how can I build and play my character that will allow this ability to work? So this is kind of the interesting part of horizontal and vertical progression, I think. Now, when we look at the Sebastian Crowe's Guide to Drakkenheim, of course, vertical progression isn't bad. It should exist, and there should be appropriate places for you to have it. Ultimately, I think your mileage will vary, and sometimes you have to think to yourself, when should I use it, when shouldn't I, and when am I getting a little excessive? For instance, I think there is one ability in 5e that 3 subclasses have, and that it's, as a subclass ability, they get proficiency in a saving throw. Samurai Fighters get it in Xanathars. Gloomstalker Rangers get it in Xanathars, and Transmutation Wizards get it in as an option in the player's handbook. So no subclass since 2016 in D&D has given a saving throw proficiency, just as a subclass ability. And in the history of the game, only 3 have. And yet in this book, Sebastian Crowe's Guide to Drakkenheim, 2 subclasses give saving throw proficiencies: Commander Fighters and Malfeasant Wizards. And I think that's a little telling. Now, of course, it's not like, oh, this is poison, this is something that just doesn't happen, how could you, this is appalling. I'm just giving this as an example to say, like, this is something that 5e design has started to move away from, just giving raw numbers boosts, especially when they start to get a little excessive. For instance, the Commander Fighter gets Wisdom Save proficiency and advantage versus Charm and Fear. At that point, with Indomitable, you're just going to always pass those saves, and it's such a boost that you're like, wow. It's like you're just erasing one little part of the game. Is it possible to still fail those saves? Yeah, technically it is still possible. So, this isn't something criminal. It's just something that I think you should, before you deploy that, you should really think, what kind of play style am I building? And oftentimes when the numbers just go up, the play style is not getting better. You may be becoming more effective, but you haven't built the play style. And Malfeasant Wizard, this is basically the whole subclass. So before we dig into that, let me just explain a little bit more about what the Malfeasant is conceptually. In the world of Drakkenheim, there is a new substance known as delirium, which is crystallized chaos magic that's fallen to Earth, and it's causing all kinds of chaos and mutations and contamination. And the Malfeasant Wizard is kind of presented as the master of those contaminated spells, the person who is willing to reject their humanity for magical power. We see here in DO. This is a bit of a meme, but the sentiment is real, and it exists in all kinds of fiction about rejecting your humanity in order to get some kind of supernatural power. I think this is particularly notable in the Warhammer Fantasy. It's greatly inspired Drakkenheim. In Warhammer Fantasy, there is a stone called Wordstone, which is a chaos rock that whenever you use magic, it starts to corrupt you and change your very form. And again, we have here, this is from Lovecraft's Dunwich Horror. Wilbur Whatley is like a weird guy who was born from an occult ritual and has all kinds of strange magic powers, and when he dies, they discover that he was some kind of contaminated, mutated guy, and that's kind of freaky. And I think the idea behind the Malfeasant Wizard is, you'd think you'd associate it with corruption, with madness, with mutation and chaos. And I think they don't really give that in this subclass at all. In fact, you kind of give the opposite. And let's get into that. Feel free to read the subclass for yourself, and we are going to go through the whole thing. But before we can get into it, let's talk quickly about what is contamination and contaminated spells. So the first thing is contamination is a new system that they have added to 5e. It's similar to exhaustion in that it appears in 6 levels. At 1, it's not so bad. At 6, something seriously has gone wrong. So in the case of contamination, by the time you get to level 3, you're still doing roughly okay. 4th level, all that your damage gets halved. Some characters this will affect more than others, but at 5, you are incapacitated. You can't take any action. Now you can still move, so potentially you can still leave the ruins, get somewhere else, get help, get out of the situation. But at 6th level, instead of dying, you instead transform into a contaminated monster. And so whenever you get a level of contamination, you're going to roll a d6, and if the number you roll is equal to or less than the number of contamination levels you have, then you're going to get a mutation, and mutations are often beneficial. So they'll be like, you grow eyes all over your body, now you have blind sight, or something like that. And so it's kind of this risk reward. It tacks on a new system to 5e that is going to pressure the party over the course of the adventuring day. So it's not just you're running out of spells or running out of HP. Maybe you can keep ahead of that with your magic items, with your skills, with careful planning, but ultimately the contamination will start to accumulate, and it really communicates that you are in a contaminated environment. Like, it feels like you're walking into Chernobyl with only raincoats on. Now, along with this design, the Dungeon Dudes have prepared a couple new contaminated spells that you can cast them. They're more powerful, but you're going to take a level of contamination. So now that you have a risk-reward thing going on, where you're like, ooh, I really need a really powerful spell right now, and I'm willing to pay for it later. And that's a cool choice that may have repercussions down the road. Almost all contaminated spells are buffed versions of existing spells. So if we compare Chromatic Orb and Delirium Orb, Chromatic Orb is a ranged attack roll. You're going to choose Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Poisoned, and it's 3d8 damage. Delirium Orb is you're going to choose Cold, Fire, Lightning, Necrotic, Psychic, or Radiant. So a lot of these damage types are much less likely to be resisted. It's going to be 6d6 damage instead of 3d8, and it's also a saving throw where you choose the ability score. So oftentimes you're going to choose Intelligence or Charisma, and so this is going to stick a lot more reliably. It's going to do more damage, and all that. In exchange, you are just taking one level of contamination. That may have consequences going forward, but this is how a lot of contaminated spells are. You have contaminated polymorph, you have contaminated cloud kill, you have contaminated hypnotic pattern. All these contaminated enhanceability. Most of the spells are existing spells, but a little buffed. They're going to stick a little harder. They're going to do a little bit more damage, and in exchange, you're going to get one level of contamination. So now that we understand this, we can go a little bit more into the Malfeasant Wizard subclass. So the first thing we're going to look at is Forbidden Study. Whenever you gain a wizard level, you're going to add one contaminated spell to your spellbook. This, I feel, is very strong. I think it's going a step too far. I think it's a very common experience for wizards at 5th level to be like, do I want Fly, Hypnotic Pattern, Fireball, or Counterspell? It's kind of a tough choice. Also, all these levels, whenever we were playing, Spider Climb kept coming up, and I kept thinking to myself, well, if only I had Spider Climb in this scenario. So I was thinking I'd get this at level up, but now all these other things are too tempting. By giving an additional spell, this is a 50%. Normally you're getting 100%, now you're getting 150% of spells. So 50% increase of what you would normally get at level up. And now you don't have to be like, ooh, Fireball, Counterspell, Hypnotic Pattern, which of these two do I want? Instead you can say, oh, I'll take Fireball and Counterspell, and I'll take Contaminated Hypnotic Pattern, which is Weave the Elder Sign. And so I think this is a very strong ability. If I were the designer here, I'd reel it back a little bit. Horrific Potential. So we talked about monsters' transformation as the ultimate consequence of contamination. For the Malfeasant in particular, when they turn into a monster, they are a slightly stronger monster than normal people. Hopefully this is not coming up. Hopefully you're not turning into a monster. But if you are, now your party has to deal with something a little tougher, which is unfortunate for them. Anomalous Materials. You have a special ability in this subclass where whenever you cast a contaminated spell, with this feature, you can just be like, I don't want to take the contamination this time. This time, I'm just not going to take the contamination. Okay, cool. That ability is not bad in and of itself, but the way it combines with the later subclass features is problematic. So let's just start by looking at Malfeasant Wizard who's level 2 to level 5. And coincidentally, I had a player in a Drakkenheim campaign of mine who played a Malfeasant Wizard from level 2 and level 5. What did it feel like? It felt like it was just a wizard that had no subclass features at all. Like, it felt like he was a guy who showed up, he cast those contaminated spells, cast a lot of Delirium Orb, he cast Warp Bolt, and guess what? They felt just like any other generic spell. Like, they felt like Chromatic Orb that dealt a little more damage, stuck a little easier. And what does that mean? It means that you feel like you don't really have a subclass. It means that you are generically stronger, the numbers have gone up, but you haven't gotten any cool new powers. And that's where we're going back to vertical versus horizontal progression. But it's just second level. Maybe they corrected at 6th level. Well, unfortunately, no. So the first thing you get is proficiency in con saves and resistance to necrotic damage. Both of these I would consider are bad calls on the design part. This is, and we're going to get into this in just a little bit. The second thing is now your contamination levels have doubled. If you had normally had 6 levels of contamination, you can go up to 12. And you're only counting those symptoms as if you had half as much. Let me remind you that 1 level of contamination isn't much. It's not really any effect at all. 2nd level of contamination is a pretty small effect. So let's just say this character can take 5 levels of contamination and plus cast 3 contaminated spells. So if they're only getting contamination from their own spell castings, they can cast 8 contaminated spells at 6th level. Which, by the way, at this level, they only have 9 spell slots total. I mean, of course, you get Arcane Recovery, so that means you're gonna get 3 more. So you get 12 spell slots total, and you can just cast 8, and you won't notice it at all. It'll feel like you're casting contaminated spells over and over, but you're not suffering any consequences from them. Maybe you might mutate. Okay, you may mutate a little more because you're taking more contamination levels. There's a greater chance that you are going to mutate. But it also says that your mutations are not checking against this 12 levels. They're only checking against half of it. So what is this? And plus, with con save proficiency, most contamination comes from failing con saves in the environments. Either the environment itself has made you make a con save, or a monster in the environment has made you make a con save, and you fail it, and you get a level of contamination. What does this mean? It means at 6th level, your party of 4 adventurers is going into the ruins. Let's say you have a rogue, a cleric, an Eldritch Knight fighter, and the wizard. Well, the Eldritch Knight fighter has a few contaminated spells, and they're going to sling them, and they have to make an interesting choice. It's like, ooh, do I use this powerful magic, but I'm going to suffer the consequences later? Maybe. Rogue is going to be hit more often, so they also don't have any con save proficiency, so because their armor class is lower, they'll uncanny dodge, so they can hang out in the front, but they are having some trouble. And the cleric is also staying a little bit away, but their con save is also not... That means, let's say we get to the end of the day. What are we looking at? Well, the rogue probably has, if we can expect this, we can expect 2 or 3 levels of contamination. The cleric has about 2. The fighter has about 3. And the wizard, if the wizard has been hanging in the back and not taking those attacks, it's passing its con saves more frequently because of the con save proficiency. It's being able to just prevent the contamination of its own spells with anomalous materials. The wizard is probably going to also have about 3 levels of contamination, but it's going to feel like it has 0 because that's the consequences of this ability. What does this mean? It means that the Malfeasant Wizard doesn't feel like the contaminated wizard. They feel like the pure wizard, right? Like they feel like the wizard who can clean up any kind of contamination. That they cast these contaminated spells, it doesn't matter. And when the contamination spells lose their contamination, they also lose their flavor. Now it's just a wizard who is casting spells that are a little better, that stick a little harder. And without that contamination choice, they've lost their flavor. And they also get this feature, Expel Contaminants, where whenever you finish a long rest, you can just tick down your levels of contamination. So, you could use Purge Contamination normally as a spell that can get rid of all your contamination levels, but you're like, I don't need that. Let's just long rest for a little bit, and I can get rid of that. And that's up until 10th level. You are the wizard who has not gotten a lot as far as building a playstyle. You've just got this giant cushion. This giant contamination cushion where you don't have to worry about contamination at all. At 10th level, finally you get an ability that lets you actually, do something, which is contaminated casting. You can upcast certain levels and in order to do so, you take on contamination levels and you get to upcast them. Now, this is This is kind of cool because it turns pretty much any spell into a contaminated spell. However, I don't think there's a ton of wizard spells that I would be too inclined to use this on. Blindness Deafness is kind of a good one. If you have spells that have multiple targets, then sometimes this could be Banishment would be another good one. But in general, I wouldn't consider this a standout feature that I'm going to use pretty consistently. But if I do use it, okay, I've got this again. I've got this huge contamination cushion that casting this just won't really matter at all. Stabilizing Focus is, again, you can ignore the symptoms of contamination levels you've gained while you're concentrating on a spell. It feels like instead of playing with the contamination system, it feels like this is a subclass that ignores the contamination system, that it refuses to take on contamination consistently, and if it does take on contamination, it just doesn't care. Those symptoms don't matter, or of course, the symptoms literally don't matter half the time in the case of increased threshold. And finally, at 14th level, if you do transform into a monster, you can maintain your control over that monster form, which is kind of cool. This is fine at 14th level. Wizards are already so powerful at 14th level. I don't want a super powerful feature. I don't want something new that's going to, trick them out. So this is a good flavor feature that maybe sometimes it will come up. Like there will be a moment in the campaign where you're like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go full monster. Like that's cool. That's a cool feature. But may I repeat what I've been saying so far? What the subclass is it's all vertical progression. None of this is horizontal progression. The new features that you're getting, these new contaminated spells, are mostly spells that already exist. This isn't a subclass about contamination. It's a subclass about ignoring contamination, which means, Barnacle Boy meme, this is the subclass with no abilities. How, if you're a designer and you're like, okay, I've got this idea for a contaminated wizard, how do you go about the design? One of the first things you could do is you could be like, oh, if we have more contaminated spells that do unique things that no other spells can do, then you could start to build a design out of that. You could be like, okay, this Malfeasant, it's okay that they don't really have any other abilities because the spells are the abilities. Well, I mean, that's a start, but I would say that ultimately you want to be able to build something that speaks for itself. You don't want to count on the player to pick the right spells to deliver the fantasy that you want. Like I think that a subclass problem should be tackled in the subclass design, not necessarily in the spell design. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, this is a subclass that should reward you for taking on contamination. Like this is a subclass where you should be like, I want to sit at 2, 3, or 4 levels of contamination, and then I'm on this knife's edge because now all of a sudden a monster might come along that starts doing contamination to me and might tip me over. It should feel like as you go up in contamination, you're going up in power, but you're also abandoning your humanity. And I think the easiest way to deliver on this fantasy is to have its own custom contamination table that it should get right at 2nd level. And so here's the new table that I designed. A lot of these, so basically you start and you have 7 levels of contamination, right? Which is different from anybody else, right? From level 2, you're going to get 1 extra level here. And so then once you get to 6, you get a new level and it'll just slot into the table like so. Once you get to 10, you'll just get a new level that'll slot into the table like so. And at 14th, you'll get a new level that'll slot into the table like so. And the way this design works is that you are going to be able to absorb more contamination than anybody else, but you are also willingly taking more contamination than anybody else, which is exactly what the contaminated spells. That's the intrigue and the mystery of the design. And also by having it be 7 that increases at these subclass levels instead of being at 6 and then being at 12, you actually get a consistent progression, that your character has steps on their path to power rather than just this complete explosion at level 12 that you never get any other bonuses to your contamination table after that, as is in the original design. I think you'll notice that a lot of these are recognizable. For instance, Corrupted Carapace. This is similar to the already existing 2nd level contamination table. The obstreperous condition is similar to the 3rd. Beyond the material is, again, this stuff is halved except for those spells in your spell book. Okay, and which is exactly what a wizard is probably wanting to do anyway. And then instead of incapacitated, the only bonus action, or reaction you can take is cast the spell in your spell book. Now, this wording, spell in your spell book, reinforces that you want to stay wizard in this subclass the whole full way. And then these new powers, I think you'll notice that oftentimes these are actual new powers that you're going to encourage you to take on contamination that already mirror things that existed in the existing subclass. So at 6th level, increased threshold, that was the name of our 6th level feature, but by putting it in this table, you can say you gain a bonus to your con saves against contamination and to maintain concentration. The bonus is equal to half your contamination level over rounded up. That's encouraging you to get and keep contamination. So if you just start your day at 3 levels, this is a +2 bonus to con saves against contamination and to maintain concentration, which I think is what they were going for, right? Like the con saves, the con saving throw proficiency, I think they were meaning it against contamination and to maintain concentration. I don't think that they were pointing towards stuff like stunning strike or cloud kill. I don't know how a Malfeasant Wizard necessarily fits that theme. So I think by keeping it narrow but strong, and then here we have a mage armor type effect here on Corrupted Carapace. Touch of Corruption is you can automatically inflict the poison condition. This is just a very small thing. As you tick up, you're just gonna keep. Ooh, I'm sorry, glitching out on me here. And then the 10th level and 14th level features, I'm a little less certain on, but I like the flavor that you're going to immediately gain a bunch of mutations, so you turn into like this weird, crazy monster-looking thing. And at 14th level, if you get your 8th level of contamination, then you're going to suddenly regain all your HP. It's just HP, you know. I think HP is the easiest thing to deplete in 5e as a Dungeon Master. And then 1 expended spell slot. If you're getting up to 8th level of contamination when you're at 14th level, and you're two beans away from turning into a horrific monster, like I think this is exactly what I want for the design. And each of these can be thought of as class features that are contingent on you interacting with the game, interacting with the contamination system. I will point out that I did include one here that Corrupt the Corrupted. This is kind of the new thing at 2nd level. It's a little hard to focus on, but it's basically says spells in your spellbook ignore the fully contaminated trait of creatures except immunity to contamination. And if we go to the back of Dungeons of Drakkenheim, we see that the fully contaminated thing says this creature is immune to contamination and has advantage on saving throws against contaminated spells. And once you read this, you're like, what? The whole point of contaminated spells is that they stick more reliably. But if the opponents that you're slinging them against have advantage against those, that's kind of a problem. Now you're being encouraged to use these spells that all the opponents have advantage on their saving throws against. So 4 is a good way around it, and that's something that's Corrupt the Corrupted is going to be something special that only the Malfeasant Wizard has. And to go back to what I was saying before, in the existing design, I really do believe that the existing design makes it feel like you're a wizard who is just casting slightly stronger spells that stick more reliably. But this fully contaminated trait means they don't stick as reliably. It's kind of a wash, right? Because oftentimes you'll be able to target a more weak save. You're going to be able to use a damage type that is less often resisted, but they're going to have advantage on their saving throws, which is, again, like I said, it's problematic. So this is the core to the change in design, I would say. As far as adjusting the other abilities, at 2nd level, instead of saying that you get these in your spellbook at level up, I would just say you can take them at level up without needing to research them. Because normally in Dungeons & Dragons, you need to research them first. And so I think this is a much more reasonable boost that you can take them at level up, but you're not going to get a 3rd spell at level up every single level. I think that's a little beyond the pale. And we can still have this anomalous materials at 2nd level, where you can choose not to get it. Now, instead of using proficiency bonus, I'd like to tie it to the class level, so you're not just dipping 2 levels in Malfeasant to be able to ignore contamination for the rest of the campaign. That seems like not what it was designed to do, so I like tying it to this, but, of course, this is inelegant. Referencing the proficiency bonus is a little more elegant, but you mess things up in multi-classing, but whatever. But I think this ability is totally fine if you have this table that now encourages players to sit at 2, 3, 4 levels of contamination and not take any more. Then this will help them not take any more, but still be able to cast contaminated spells. So with that foundation of a design, you can then add this. And then at 6th level, in the same way that you could decrease your contamination level on a long rest, I made that practically the same here, except instead of referencing the proficiency bonus, it's referencing the subclass levels, which, again, I feel is generally better in subclass design. And And it also says that whenever you finish your long rest, you can reduce or increase. You know, you, increasing your contamination is going to give you more power. So maybe you want to increase it. That's cool, and that makes the feature a little more usable. For the high level features, we can just keep them the same. You know, by changing the foundation of the design, by building the actual coherent playstyle at second and sixth, then the 10th level feature is a lot more appropriate. Now, the other 10th level feature that you want to ignore contamination symptoms while you're concentrating on a spell, you don't want that, right? Because now the contamination symptoms table is the subclass of this one. So you probably want to take out that feature. But being able to upcast your spells by taking on contamination, cool. And turning into a monster and then still having control of your monster form, also cool. So yeah, I think the change I've made here, and particularly I want to call out Unfettered, that your intelligence score is increasing by 4 to a maximum of 30. If you really want to charge up this full way, you are becoming something beyond the material. You're becoming something inhuman, as I reference here in this is the first episode of the original series of Star Trek, where this guy starts to develop these godlike powers. He loses touch with his humanity. This is the story I wanted to capture with the design, and honestly, I think that's also kind of what the original designers wanted to capture too. But I think I don't know if they, you know, I don't want to. Let me walk this back. I don't want to necessarily call out designers for you know, I'm not going to give them attributes that maybe aren't fair. I'm just saying that I think that this is a much more coherent design. It's more fun. It's building a play style. It's reinforcing the theme that you want, and it's giving your player an option, an ability to make a cool character. This is the horizontal design that you want, where you get to pick where you want your contamination level to sit out, which of these powers you're willing to take on, and which of these powers are you willing to risk, and living on that knife's edge, and maybe potentially tipping over, and letting the player decide as well as the dice. This is the mutant wizard. This is the chaos wizard. This is the wizard who's abandoning their humanity for power. And I think this is the design well, I don't want to say the design, right? There's any number of ways that you could build it. But I think by focusing on this foundation of the table, increasing it as you go up in levels, referencing contamination levels as far as your class abilities go, and actually encouraging you to sit and have these levels. I think that is the design that's going to be kind of the foundation of the design that is going to encourage and bring to life that fantasy.